About 14 hours ago, Matt Walsh released a video on his YouTube channel essentially saying that the evidence base for antidepressants and SSRI medication was essentially bogus, completely overblown, and it would not hold up to any scrutiny. He went on to say that the deception about antidepressant research has led to one of the biggest controversies in modern medicine, the overprescription of medications that essentially, from his perspective, don't work. These may seem like bold claims, but that's what we're going to be reacting to today. Is he right about this? Or did he get some things wrong? That's what we're going to be looking at today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring, and I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, and I specialize in helping people safely taper off medications. With that aside, let's jump into today's video.
Imagine that we're back in the late 1980s or early 1990s, and you're feeling depressed, and nobody wants to talk to you, so you pay a psychiatrist to listen to your problems, but even after talking things out with your shrink, you're still not feeling great, and all hope seems lost. Then the shrink tells you not to despair because you have an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial for a new class of drug that has the potential to cure all of your symptoms called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. And if you enter the trial, you have a chance of getting the new SSRI drug, or you could get a placebo that does nothing. But you're told it's a win-win. You know, if you participate in the clinical trial, Big Pharma will get some more data on whether this new class of drug actually works, and you have a chance of being cured. If you're not cured, then in all likelihood, the worst case scenario is, is not a big deal. Either you get a placebo and nothing changes, or you get the real drug, which has relatively modest side effects like dry mouth, nausea, dizziness, and so on. In exchange for enduring those side effects, your depression might go away. So what do you have to lose? Well, this was the process that drug companies used to convince the world that SSRIs worked. After running a bunch of double-blind clinical trials, they found that people who took the SSRIs ultimately reported that they felt better than people who received the placebo. And therefore, we were told that the whole serotonin theory of depression must be true. After all, when people took SSRIs and had more serotonin in their brains, their depression went away. People who took the sugar pill didn't do as well, so there you have it. Science wins again. But there's a major problem with this whole methodology, and it's a problem that somehow didn't occur to any of the media outlets or physicians who pushed SSRIs for many decades. And you might have to think about it for a few minutes, but eventually it becomes obvious. Here's the issue. In practice, these clinical trials were not actually double-blind studies. The vast majority of patients were able to break blind, as they say in the industry, and that means they were able to figure out whether they got the real SSRI or the placebo, which destroys the whole study. And that's because in most cases, the patients who got the real drug very quickly noticed that they were experiencing some of the side effects. After all, if you take a pill and you start experiencing dry mouth or nausea or something like that, then you'll probably conclude that you're taking an active medication. And that's exactly what happened in many of these trials. In fact, one study conducted by researchers at Columbia says that 89% of participants correctly guessed that they were on the SSRI, which is an extremely high number for a clinical trial. Now, you could probably see the issue, hopefully. If the studies aren't really double-blind, then we have no way of knowing if the SSRIs actually improved people's minds. It's quite possible that these patients were actually feeling better because they thought they were taking a wonder drug. And because we're talking about people's emotional state, which is very fickle and highly suggestible, if you tell them they're taking a wonder drug that will make them feel better, a lot of people will just feel better because you told them that they would. And they convinced themselves that it was working, so they told the therapist that they were improving. And this is commonly referred to as the placebo effect, of course. And the only way to defeat it, particularly when you're trying to assess the effectiveness of psychoactive drugs, is with double-blind studies. But that didn't really happen with SSRI.
Because it's not possible, right? You know, with any psychiatric medication, and this really calls into question why we even do double-blind studies in psychiatry, right? Because you could do, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to do a double-blind study maybe with like, let's say an antibiotic or something like that. You know, one group of people gets the antibiotic for the infection, the other group doesn't, and the infection goes away. But there's a lot of the times there's not really strong side effects to the medication where you could detect it, where you could detect that you got the fake pill and break blind. But with psychiatric medications, essentially you're taking drugs which alter your mind. I mean, these are powerful medications. They can blunt you out. They can make you feel very indifferent. They can cause a whole range of side effects. And so in any double-blind placebo-controlled trial of a psychiatric medication, he's absolutely right. Probably most of the people are going to be able to tell whether they got the active medication or the placebo.
And this is not some crackpot theory, by the way. A few years ago, a researcher at Harvard named Irving Kirsch found that, quote, analysis of the published data and the unpublished data that were hidden by drug companies reveals that most, if not all, of the benefits are due to the placebo effect. The relatively small differences between drug and placebo in antidepressant trials are at least in part due to breaking blind and discerning that one is in the drug group because of the side effects produced by the drug.
Let's add a little bit of detail to that, because I know the paper he's talking about. So Irving Kirsch used a FOIA request. This is Freedom of Information. And this was a big story about maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I think, something like that. And what they found was that drug companies weren't publishing the studies that failed. And so we had a lot of studies in the public domain that it looked like these antidepressant medications worked. But then when people asked to see the full dossier of clinical trials submitted to the FDA, what they noticed was that there was a lot of negative studies in there, studies where the drug and the placebo failed to differentiate. And instead of the pharmaceutical companies publishing that in the public domain, they essentially left it hidden. They essentially, it was just like kind of shoved in the clinical study report, sent to the FDA. And so when Irving Kirsch got a hold of this and he looked at all of the SSRI medications on the market, he found that the drug effect significantly decreased. I believe, if I remember correctly, it was like 2.7 or a 3-point difference between drug and placebo. Now, in order for that to make sense, you have to understand the scale. And I believe he was looking at the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, which is a 52-point scale. And so a 2.7 to 3-point difference on a 52-point scale is practically nothing. Now, one that was controversial on its own, but what Matt's talking about now was, wasn't even brought into it. But this is what Irving Kirsch did. He said that, given that the drug placebo difference is only 2.7 points, there's a good chance that that difference could be accounted for by the placebo effect, by the fact that, like Matt was saying a moment ago, nearly 90% of people actually knew whether they got the drug versus the placebo. And because of that expectancy bias, because they were told coming into the trial, hey, you may be on a powerful new antidepressant medication that's going to fix depression, they would have felt something in their body and they say, oh man, I'm on the real deal here. And then they would have felt more hopeful. And that might be enough to swing a scale by 3 points. And that essentially could be enough to say that there's no difference between drug and placebo when measured on that scale.
Now, Kirsch goes on to suggest that instead of SSRIs, maybe all patients should just be given a placebo. After all, based on the FDA's data, less than 45% of SSRI trials showed a statistically significant benefit of the SSRI over a placebo. And the placebo, of course, has no side effects.
Well, we have to remember what a placebo is in this, because maybe some people hearing this would be like, oh, you just go to your doctor and they just give you sugar pills, essentially. And I'm going to get the same effect. Well, not quite. The reason a lot of people do so much better in a clinical trial for depression is because it's incredibly intensive. I mean, you go there, you talk to a doctor, they ask you a lot of questions about your depression, and then you come back each week, they ask you how you're feeling. There's a lot of social interaction. You feel like you're part of a bigger cause. There's some financial incentives, and so it's not as simple as just getting a sugar pill. It's the whole enterprise of engaging with healthcare professionals, having people call you, checking in on you, going places. All of that may give someone a temporary bump in their mood. So it's a lot more than just the pill.
But as we all know, there's no money in prescribing sugar pills. So instead, doctors in the pharmaceutical industry pushed SSRIs based on these garbage clinical trials, which fall apart under the slimmest possible scrutiny. The use of SSRIs among teenagers and adults in this country increased by almost 400%.
Before we move on, I want to cover something that I think is really poorly understood. Now, it could be really easy to hear what Matt is saying, and which is all of it technically correct and say antidepressant medications, they simply don't work. There's no difference from the placebo. But I've taken antidepressant medications and I've given them to a lot of people before, and they definitely have an effect. It's an obvious effect. It's a blunting effect. And this blunting effect can be therapeutic for some people, especially if you're highly anxious. Especially if you're highly anxious. And so you might be asking, well, hey, Dr. Josef, if these effects are so strong, why does it look like in this clinical trial analysis that they're no different from placebo? And the answer to that question is that these studies are garbage. They're absolute trash. The scale that they use to measure the effect of antidepressants is just some random scale that a bunch of doctors voted on to say, okay, this is what we think is depression. And then they measured the effect of this drug against it. So it was a scale that assessed a whole bunch of arbitrary depression criteria items instead of a scale that was actually designed to detect the effect of the drug, which is, for antidepressants, most of them, like the SSRIs, is a blunting or sedating effect. Sometimes it's a little energizing. And so if they actually used a scale that did that, they would have found an effect. Now, because psychiatric research is really uninspired, and the researchers really aren't that good in this area, they haven't done anything about it. They're stuck in precedent, and they're using this scale from pretty much like the 50s. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I did a video, which we'll have kind of linked up here right now, doing a deep dive into more of the problems with the antidepressant research and simply why it doesn't detect any differences. But from my perspective, yes, there certainly is an antidepressant. There certainly is a blunting effect from these drugs, and they can be beneficial for some people, and some people they can be harmful. I mean, some people being blunted doesn't make them feel any better. But all of that is missed in this research. Anyway, so let's move on.
From the early 1990s to 2006, and it kept going up. By 2014, 1 in 10 adults was filling an SSRI prescription. From 2015 to 2021, SSRI use increased by another 35%. So we're talking about tens of millions of prescriptions here. And meanwhile, the number of Americans suffering from depression has only kept increasing. According to Gallup in 2023, the percentage of U.S. adults who reported having been diagnosed with depression at some point in their lifetime reached 29%, nearly 10 percentage points higher than in 2015. So, in other words, we are more depressed than ever, and at the same time, we're taking more antidepressants than ever. And if antidepressants are actually working, then you should see that trend going in the opposite direction, but it's not. Now, these prescriptions have continued even after one of the most prominent medical journals on the planet admitted that actually doctors no longer think that low serotonin levels are linked to depression. In other words, if these drugs actually work, then no one can really explain why. Quoting from the journal Molecular Psychiatry, our comprehensive review of the major strands of research on serotonin show there is no convincing evidence that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activity.
So let's stop there. Back in the in the 70s to 80s, psychiatric researchers started saying, wow, we think, depression could be due to a chemical imbalance. And that's because back then they had just discovered medications which they knew had serotonin boosting properties, and they would give them to patients, and they would notice, like I mentioned, this drug effect where some people who would be riddled by anxiety would feel more calm. And so they said, well, maybe this has to do with low serotonin levels. Well, that's kind of wishful thinking, because the reason the people may have been doing better at the time is you've just given them drugs. Yeah, you've given them drugs that mute the effects of their symptoms. And that was probably, that is, the much more likely explanation. But that story really wasn't picked up because that wasn't a story of tremendous medical improvement. Doctors at that time, they were coming off the end of like the antibiotic era where, we'd found antibiotics and they were like these magic bullets and they would hit this illness. And psychiatrists wanted to be like these impressive doctors, and they say, yeah, we've localized the problem. in people who are unhappy. It's called depression. And we've got something, it's this sort of chemical bullet, and it's going to fix it. So it's a story that that's a lot more impressive, that kind of speaks to scientific progress. And so people latched onto it. But the more sinister thing that happened at this time was that the pharmaceutical industry really ran with it, and they put it in all of their ads. I mean, there's a really famous Zoloft commercial, which you can find on YouTube, with these bouncing blobs. And it essentially says, like, if you're depressed, you may have a chemical imbalance. Go and talk to your doctor about it. And so the idea of having low serotonin and a chemical imbalance entered the zeitgeist at the time. And so if you were unhappy, people would say, well, maybe you've got this brain disease, this chemical imbalance. And well, what do you know? We actually have these brand new drugs that act on serotonin, and they fix these things. And so the American public and the public of the world, unfortunately, because our media goes everywhere, has been tricked now, after, 2 to 3 decades of just hearing from drug companies and academic doctors who are kind of on the take from these companies that, depression's this biological illness. And because it's a biological illness, it needs to be fixed with a biological agent, like a medication. And for the most part, people have stopped looking at root causes, whether it's like life stresses, dietary problems, medical issues. They're just focusing on this chemical imbalance because it's easier to sell drugs that way.
Most studies found no evidence of reduced serotonin activity in people with depression compared to people without. This review suggests that the huge research effort based on the serotonin hypothesis has not produced convincing evidence of a biochemical basis to depression.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. In this review paper by Joanna Moncrieff in Nature, they looked at studies where they would measure serotonin levels in this cerebral spinal fluid via spinal tap of patients with depression. No difference in serotonin metabolites there. They would look at post-mortem studies of serotonin receptors from people who had passed away with depression. They'd compare them to norms. No difference there. And so really, there's no evidence of any chemical imbalance showing up in people who are diagnosed with depression.
I'll say that again. This review suggests that the Hughes research effort based on the serotonin hypothesis has not produced convincing evidence of a biochemical basis to depression. This was a paper published in the summer of 2022 by one of the top journals in the entire field of medicine. And yet, to this day, if you suggest that depression is not related to a chemical imbalance, if you suggest that it is not biochemical, which is what that study showed, that it's not biochemical, then you will still be dogpiled for doing so.
People get really upset about this, that they can be very defensive, because think about it. There's conceptually, and for someone's identity, there's a big difference between I'm taking a medication because there's something wrong with my brain. I have a medical condition. I kind of have no agency over it. It was genetic. I was kind of born into it. And now I just need to take this thing, nothing to see here. I'm just suffering from a medical problem. There's a big difference between that and I'm unhappy and I'm taking a drug to numb my symptoms. Now I get it. And I get why that can be really uncomfortable for some people to hear, because there have been occasions in the past where people would assign some kind of like moral or religious attribution to that. They'd say, oh, you're unhappy because you've wronged God in some way, or you're not living in a morally good way. Or maybe the more modern version is you just can't hack it. You're a weak person. And so I think for a long time, people kind of, they almost went along with this white lie where it was just like, well, we want to sidestep all like the moral and, all of the moral implications of someone being unhappy. And we just want to tell them they have a medical problem because that's going to be an easier pill for them to swallow. It's not going to stigmatize them, although I hate that word because it's overused. And so we kind of go ahead with it. But you see what the problem is there? The problem is you don't get curious about the root cause. You essentially say, oh, it's just in your brain and this drug is going to fix that. But it's not true. It's not true at all. Like you said, we haven't found any chemical imbalance. Whatever the reason that's making you unhappy is unknown. It could be life stresses, it could be medical, it could be dietary, or it could be something else. But people aren't curious about that anymore. And so, yeah, he's right. When you question that someone doesn't really have a chemical imbalance and they're just drugging themselves, it makes people incredibly uncomfortable, and they can, like he says, they can dogpile on you. But it's a harsh truth. And I guess what I want to say as well before we go on, I'm not saying that there's no genetic side to depression. Some people are born more neurotic. They are predisposed to being unhappy. But the problem is we don't even look these days. And some people aren't even curious about it themselves because they've seen so many TikTok videos and things in the news about depression just being a chemical imbalance that they overlook, their trauma or the job they hate or their dysfunctional relationship or the fact that they're medically they're unwell and out of shape. They sidestep all of that now, and they just kind of latch onto this thing. And so, yes, for some people there can be some genetic predisposition, but there's a massive amount of people who are living unhealthy, stressful lives where it's really obvious why they may be feeling poorly, but they don't want to look at it, and they can get really defensive about that.
Well, to have anything approaching an honest conversation about depression and SSRIs in this country, because many of the people on these drugs will just lash out with blind rage if you even suggest that depression might have causes that go deeper than chemical imbalances. If you try to talk about the problem of despair, which is what depression is, if you try to talk about it with any depth or nuance at all, you're screamed out of the room by drug addicts who don't know they're drug addicts.
I don't know if you should have called them drug addicts there, but I get what he's saying. Probably not the right way to say it. The more sinister thing here is, yes, there are people in the public domain there are patients out there who will get very offended by this. But the worst, the people who are the worst here are actually academic psychiatrists. And so we have a bunch of like psychiatrists and big psychiatric organizations who, they're not really objective scientists anymore. They've almost become advocates for the drugs because, the things that Matt's saying so far are completely true. And people have been criticizing psychiatric medications for a long time, for the fact that in a small group of people, they have paradoxical reactions and it can make them suicidal. The fact that we really don't know if they work long-term or if they make people worse. So there's been a lot of these things coming out there. And instead of psychiatric leaders saying, yes, there's a lot of uncertainty here, we need to look into it, we need to protect people, they start defending the drugs blindly as if they're advocates for it, almost because they want to defend the prestige of their profession, because psychiatrists and doctors, we give the medications. And so we are, different from psychologists, and, we are all powerful, and let's not talk bad about them. And so these leaders from like Harvard and Yale and these big institutions, when people criticize them, they come out and they say things like, you're dangerous, you're scaring people away from the drugs, you're causing suicides, you're a Scientologist. They blindly attack these people. Again, I'm going to say that again. The psychiatric leaders are not objective scientists anymore. They are advocates for the medications to kind of protect their profession. And I've seen them do some really nasty things whenever people criticize these meds, appropriately criticize these meds.
But the truth is that none of the support for SSRIs is based on reality. The whole class of drugs has been peddled to tens of millions of people based on complete fabrications, based on bad studies, and based on bunk theories.
The other thing I want to add here is a lot of people don't know this, but antidepressant styles, like the efficacy portion of it, where you see how effective they are, it lasted for 3 months. Now, most people who take these medications, they take them for several years. And listen, if you're a clinical psychiatrist, or even if you're someone who's taken these medications, they wear off in maybe 6 months, maybe 2 years, and then you need a higher dose, and then you need a higher dose. And so these are drugs that people's brains, because of homeostatic mechanisms, become dependent to over time. And so we don't even know how long people can be on these drugs for before they adapt to them. And then all of a sudden they're just sort of stuck on this thing, and it's causing side effects and it's not really helping them. I mean, that's the big secret going on here, that we're told that these drugs are safe and effective, but really it should be, safe and effective for maybe the 3 months they were studied for. And when it comes to long-term use, we don't know. We have no idea what's going on. We don't know who they're going to benefit. We don't know who they're going to harm. In my line of work, I see a lot of harms, unfortunately.
It's not an overstatement to say this is one of the great medical scandals of our time.
Here, this is crazy, people. We have 16 16% of the people maybe taking these medications now, antidepressants, like all over the world, who have been told this is like a chemical imbalance, who have been told these medications are safe and effective when we have no idea how they work in the long run, when there's hundreds of thousands of people online in groups like Surviving Antidepressants. If you want to see the saddest, scariest place in the world, go there, because you'll see people who have been trying to come off these medications for years and have sustained brain damage. This is not a small group of people. This is hundreds of thousands of people there. On Facebook, there's groups all over the place on Facebook, like Cymbalta Hurts Worse, for every single antidepressant out there, of people who cannot get off them and who've had their brains damaged by these medications. And you would have never heard about it because, like I said, the psychiatric leaders are, they're not objective about this anymore. They're kind of involved in just almost in like a cover up in some way. It's really sad.
What's changing now is that finally someone in a position of authority is willing to investigate these drugs and many other drugs like them. A few days ago, via executive order, the Trump administration established something called the Make America Healthy Again Commission, or MAHA, and MAHA, I guess maybe is how you pronounce it. And it'll be headed by RFK Jr. And the purpose of the commission, according to the White House, is to determine why Americans have shorter life expectancies than people living in other nations, as well as higher rates of chronic diseases like cancer and asthma. And part of this effort means assessing the, quote, prevalence of and threat posed by the prescription of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, stimulants, and weight loss drugs.
Last Thursday, President Trump signed an executive order to establish the MAHA Commission to study what has caused the precipitous decline in American health over the past 2 generations. So we will convene representatives of all viewpoints to study the causes for the drastic rise in chronic disease. Some of the possible factors we will investigate were formerly taboo or insufficiently scrutinized. The childhood vaccine schedule, electromagnetic radiation, glyphosate, other pesticides, ultra-processed foods, artificial food additives, SSRI and other psychiatric drugs, PFAs, PFOAs, microplastics. Nothing is going to be off limits.
It's crazy, as I was hearing that list, like vaccines, food, microplastics, electromagnetic radiation. I may sound cynical and like I'm wearing a tin hat, but each one of these products is a massive industry behind it, whether it's like, big mobile phone, pesticides like Monsanto and these big chemical companies, plastics, that's petrochemicals, vaccines, SSRIs. We're talking about the pharmaceutical industry. Isn't it interesting that every time there's a big organization with huge commercial interest behind something that's really controversial, and if you ever say anything about it, you get attacked, essentially as being as not trusting the science, that we should trust these institutions that run these studies that always paint their products in the best possible light. And so they attack people. And I think that's just the playbook. And, Matt's totally right. And RFK Jr. is totally right that we need to be looking at, what have been the consequences of letting the pharmaceutical industry just run unchecked and just promote the heck out of these medications when there's essentially a psychiatric organization who aren't objective about the medications because they're more advocates for them because they're trying to increase the prestige of their profession and they don't want to talk about it. I do think we need to look at what's happened to the American people because of this. And gosh, when they start looking at foster homes or maybe senior living homes, they're going to be shocked because the patients there, they're riddled with antipsychotics. They're essentially just like locked away and they're drugged into oblivion because they're having behavioral problems and essentially no one has any time to deal with them and they don't want to. And they're going to find some really, really bad things when they look at how these drugs are being used at the moment.
Now, as you heard, RFK's commission is going to be focused on gathering data. They're not banning anything outright. They're not punishing doctors for prescribing anything.
This is crazy. I've seen like psychos on the Facebook groups that I'm a part of. They're just like, oh my God, RFK Jr. is banning antidepressants. Like my patients are now stockpiling them. people, he's not banning antidepressants. He has acknowledged that for some people they're useful. We just need to look at the scope of the problem. I think people are purposefully misinterpreting this because they don't like Trump and he's associated with Trump.
Instead, they're doing what the government should have done several decades ago. They're looking at the existing evidence and determining whether it's valid or not. They're not going to simply accept clinical trials without looking closely at them. They're going to see whether it makes sense to keep prescribing these drugs to so many Americans, particularly young people. Now, you have to wonder what kind of person would object to a fact-finding effort like this.
Well, the FDA would, because if they go in there and they look at these clinical trials, they'll say, hey, FDA, why do you think it's okay to say these drugs are safe long-term when, like 15% of the population is kind of taking these medications now? And you think it's all right to do a 3-month study on these when people take them for years? You think that's good enough evidence? I think there's going to be a lot of questions people at the FDA are going to have to answer to with respect to not requiring more data, just given the prevalence of use of these medications and all of the risks that have come out about them.
After all, if SSRIs and other drugs that he mentioned actually work as advertised, then the extra scrutiny wouldn't be a problem at all. But RFK Jr. has received a lot of pushback because of this. Newsweek, for example, recently took aim at RFK's claim that antidepressants can be more addictive than heroin. They cited a Stanford professor as saying, quote, antidepressants and heroin are in different universes when it comes to addiction risk. In my 35 years in the addiction field, I've met only 2 or 3 people who thought they were addicted to antidepressants versus thousands who were addicted to heroin and other opioids.
So this is something I can speak to in depth because this is what I do. I help people come off these medications, and there's gray here. So what I'll say is a lot of people won't have difficulty coming off these medications. When they do taper off, they'll come off in a couple of months and they'll be very uncomfortable, maybe for a month or 2, but then their brains bounce back and they feel okay. So that can happen for many people, especially if they haven't used them long term. But for some people who are really sensitive or they've been on high doses for a long period of time, speaking about decades, these drugs can be just as hard to come off as heroin. When I do these tapers, they can last 1 to 2 years. And the thing that a lot of people miss is that, and this is the difference between coming off antidepressants and coming off heroin. When you come off antidepressants, you can cause yourself a brain injury. You essentially can develop something called protracted withdrawal. And if you're a new listener right now, you might have say, this sounds crazy, brain injury from coming off antidepressants. How is this even real? Like, you're a quack doctor. It's not just me. This is listed in the NICE guidelines. This is the major guideline used in the UK. It's one of the most well-respected guidelines on treating depression, and it's written right in there that that you can have severe withdrawal symptoms lasting months to a year or longer, and that is especially common when people are rapidly pulled off these drugs. This has also been endorsed by the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, and there's probably like 20 articles about this in the medical literature. And so you'd be right to be wondering, why haven't I ever heard of this? Again, you haven't heard of it because it just sits in the medical literature and there's no big organization with lots of money to promote it to people. And, the psychiatric leaders essentially don't want to do it because it makes the profession look bad. So essentially what happens with these people is they'll go and see the doctor. The doctor will say, don't worry, the withdrawal is mild and self-limiting. And this person's been on it for like a decade. And then they tape them off in 2 months and they develop severe withdrawal symptoms. And the doctor says, just wait a little bit longer. It'll be okay. Nothing to see here. And then shortly after that, the bottom falls out. They develop ringing in their ears, light sensitivity. They develop severe anxiety, like you couldn't even imagine, like crippling, make you feel insane anxiety. You develop cognitive impairment where you can't even think straight. And some people even develop paresthesias. Their hands and feet start to tingle. This obviously scares them tremendously. And so they go back on the medication. But what do they find? They find that it doesn't get any better because they're not in withdrawal anymore. The withdrawal reaction has caused massive amounts of excitation in the brain, and that's become neurotoxic. They've actually had a brain injury. And so they have these terrible symptoms. They try and go back on the drug, and it doesn't go away. Now, this excitatory storm that happens during withdrawal that, for reasons we don't understand, a small portion of people are sensitive to. It's like a traumatic brain injury. I mean, it's like you've fallen out of a building onto the ground and smacked your head, or you've been rear-ended. This is a brain injury. It's a global brain injury. And it can take years for people to recover from this. This is what I do. This is 75% of my patients right now have these drug injuries. Their nervous systems are highly sensitized and they're wanting to come off the drugs. And because this is such a painful thing and it takes years to recover from after it's happened, much like a traumatic brain injury, that's why people think this is harder to come off than heroin, because heroin doesn't cause a brain injury that you can't do anything about, and you simply have to wait out for 2 years. With opiate withdrawal, it's usually terrible for like a couple of months, and then it slowly gets better. It's not terrible for a couple of years. So yes, for some people, antidepressants are way harder to come off and way more dangerous to come off than opiates. And this is not just me, some crackpot doctor, and, Matt Walsh from, the conservative media saying these things because we hate antidepressants. Read the nice guidelines, look at what the Royal College of Psychiatrists is saying, go to PubMed, search antidepressant protracted withdrawal. This is a recognized phenomenon, but people have just never heard of it, which is crazy when you think about how many people are taking this.
Did you notice the qualifier there? I've met only 2 or 3 people who thought they were addicted to antidepressants. So one thing we could take away from that is that people who take these drugs tend to be in a lot of denial. And I think,
well, they have no idea, something terrible happens to them when they try and come off. And what the doctor actually usually says is, oh, it's your underlying condition, because they've tapered them too quickly. After you've been on a drug for like a decade and your brain is adapted to it, that drug is like scaffolding in your brain. And if you remove it in 2 weeks, you completely outpace the ability for your brain to adapt to the absence of that drug, upregulate receptors and such, and you go into tremendous withdrawal. And so most doctors will just say, oh, it's your underlying condition coming back. You have to stay on the drug forever. And that's the biggest way that people get duped about this. And then they end up staying on a drug they don't need to for the rest of their life, probably suffering from side effects that they wanted to avoid, and that's why they wanted to come off. It's awful.
The very idea that you could become addicted to them doesn't occur to a lot of the people taking these drugs. They don't even think that that's a thing that can happen. And so when they have this compulsion to keep taking the antidepressant, they don't see it as an addiction.
Yeah. Again, this whole chemical imbalance thing comes into it. People think of it as like this vitamin that fixes their serotonin levels, rather than it's a drug like alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine. It has a drug effect. It's masking your symptoms. And because your brain, is involved in all of the physiology of your body, when you start to perturb it by altering the serotonin levels by using a drug, you're throwing out of balance like the neurological systems controlling your heart and controlling your GI tract. And then your body's going to send signals back up to your brain saying, hey, we need you to downregulate receptors because our physiology is out of whack. And so the brain changes and the brain adapts to these things. But again, doctors aren't telling patients this. And they're just misleading them and trying to lull them into a sense of security about taking these drugs.
And according to this addiction specialist, because they don't see it as an addiction, it isn't one. I mean, this is the kind of quote unquote science that's behind so much of the psychiatric field. And it's
addiction. One last comment there. He's kind of playing like he's kind of saying it in a, this is misleading. Essentially when psychiatrists use the word addiction, they mean, drug seeking behavior, using the medications more than you should, maybe engaging in criminal activity to get more of it. That's what doctors usually mean by addiction. So he's saying, oh, people aren't addicted to antidepressants because yes, people aren't, doing terrible things to get them. But what Matt means and what most people think of when they hear things like addiction, especially like the, people who aren't doctors, is dependence. You are physiologically dependent to it. And that is completely true.
Has propelled millions of people to end up on these drugs is this kind of totally bunk, ridiculous nonsense that they call science. So we're meant to conclude that RFK is a conspiracy theorist for even suggesting that SSRIs can cause dependency. But just a few years ago, that was not a conspiracy theory at all. It was settled science. In 2018, the New York Times published an article titled, "Many people taking antidepressants discover they cannot quit." Here's some of the relevant findings. Quote, in New Zealand, where prescriptions are at historic highs, a survey of long-term users found that withdrawal was the most common complaint, cited by 3/4 of longtime users. In a recent survey of 250 long-term users of psychiatric drugs, most commonly antidepressants, about half who wound down their prescriptions rated the withdrawal as severe. Nearly half who tried to quit could not do so because of these symptoms. In another study of 180 longtime antidepressant users, withdrawal symptoms were reported by more than 130. Almost half said they felt addicted to antidepressants. Close quote.
Now, so you have to think about it. Why would people be so resistant to RFK Jr. looking into this? Well, I think it's because Matt is right. And when they look into it, they're going to find a psychiatric research establishment that has been completely complicit with overblowing what the studies show. You know, one, the studies are poorly designed. They do not support that they're safe and effective for any more than about 3 months. And I think it's going to lead to a whole bunch of other things. You know, they're going to look at, you know, why are these academic psychiatrists at Yale and Harvard and all these big institutions so pro-drug and so quick to defend it? They're going to find out that it's due to careerism, that these academics have ascended to positions of power in their institutions because they've helped drug companies do clinical trials, and it's padded their CVs, and they've been able to demonstrate that they're international experts because the drug companies fly them around the place. This is fact. The fastest way to become an academic leader in psychiatry is to do clinical trial research because it generates so much stuff in your resume. And most doctors will work with the pharmaceutical industry because they have a lot of administrative support and funding. The academic institutions are more than happy to go along with it because grant money brings prestige to their institutions. They want their buildings to be big and glittering and fantastic. And the more academic psychiatrists running clinical trials for drug companies, the better, the more of a wow factor it has to people who come there and then want to donate money. And so if you follow the money and you look at the career advancement and you just start to see the whole thing has been perverted by money and the desire to advance one's career or the position of a profession like psychiatry. It does not have the patient front and center. It does not have their protection as the main thing. It's become completely perverted. And I think that's what we're going to find. If RFK Jr. really digs into this, that's what he'll find. He'll find the corruption of science and the betrayal of patients. It's terrible.
If you compare those numbers to the percentage of heroin users who become addicted within a month of using the drug, you'll find that RFK actually has a point. By one estimate, up to 38% of new heroin users become dependent within a year, which is a lot, obviously, but it's less than the number of antidepressant users who reported feeling severe withdrawal symptoms. And this is why RFK's commission is an important step. It's clear that we have a lot of evidence that antidepressants are causing far more harm than most people realize. But they're not seeing the evidence because it's being suppressed. And a transparent commission could solve that problem. It can also address this objection, which was just published by the left-wing outlet Mother Jones. Quote, in a 2023 live stream on X with Elon Musk, RFK claimed that tremendous circumstantial evidence suggested that people taking antidepressants were more likely to commit school shootings. Actually, most school shooters were not taking those drugs, evidence shows.
So this is one of the craziest things that people get caught up on. And again, this is another one of these things where people are just like, you have to trust the science. You know, the scientists say it can't do it. It's bogus because it's common sense that these drugs can make people suicidal and even homicidal. And you just need to think about it. I mean, these drugs, they carry warnings that they make people suicidal. It's completely accepted. And the way that they do that is that there is a group of people who are genetically susceptible to have adverse behavioral side effects. And so imagine this, you are depressed and you take a drug and you have one of these atypical reactions to it. Remember, these are strong psychiatric medications that usually induce this kind of blunted feeling. But let's say because you're susceptible to it, you become agitated and depressed, and maybe you even start to hallucinate. Much like when you could get like 10 people smoking some weed and, 9 of them are having a good time and they're giggling and one person becomes really paranoid. This happens with everything, every single drug. You can't predict how everyone's going to respond to it. And with antidepressants, they can cause adverse behavioral side effects. And yes, they can make people suicidal. And yes, if you take one of them and you have one of these reactions, which is fairly common, where it is well known these drugs can trigger mania, and you can get someone who all of a sudden is taking it long term and they're feeling very blunted, and they also become maybe grandiose, and they also become dysphoric, and they become paranoid. These are the states of mind that could push someone into committing acts of homicide. This is just a risk that happens when you take powerful psychiatric medications that affect the mind. And so, yes, absolutely, these drugs can be involved in violent behavior in some people, and we should be looking at them when there's unspeakable atrocities, when someone unexpectedly takes out a whole bunch of people. We need to be looking at, were they really in their right mind? Is there a clinical history suggestive of drug-induced homicidal behavior? Now, I know, and Matt goes on to say in a little bit that this information usually isn't known because the hospitals won't share it and maybe the families won't share it. But in the one case that I have seen, when James Holmes, the Aurora shooter, who dressed up as Batman and mowed down nearly 50 people in a cinema, David Healy interviewed him. And I think they did a whole episode on this. There's a documentary out there. And maybe it's even on YouTube, the clinical history is highly suggestive of him going into a manic episode prior to committing this mass murder. And if you just look at him when he got arraigned and pulled into court, he has bright red hair. His eyes are wide open and wide. This is the look of someone who is manic. And the clinical history suggested that the medication that he was on, right after he increased the dose, it tipped him over the edge. Now, this hardly happens in these cases because the mass shooters are either killed or maybe the family is ashamed and they don't want to talk about it, and the hospitals don't want to say. But when things like this happen, we should be looking for evidence of drug-induced murder, because maybe if these things are happening and we know they're happening, we can go to the state legislature and say, if you put someone on this medication, you need to make them sign a piece of paper saying they understand that it could make them suicidal or violent. It's very rare, but it could do that. And that someone else that knows the person can be keeping an eye on them as well, and you can also say, yes, I will watch them and I will make sure if anything changes in their behavior, I call you straight away. So these are the types of things that could happen. If we actually had good data about this, we could make better laws to keep people safe. But all of this stuff is super hush-hush. It's quiet. And obviously it is, because selling antidepressants is big business.
Now, this is another common refrain you hear from the defenders, the apologists for SSRIs. They say that most school shooters were not taking SSRIs. As we've previously discussed, there are two major problems with that line. First of all, we don't actually know what drugs a school shooter was taking unless the family discloses it. The police and hospitals aren't going to tell anyone, citing privacy laws. And in pretty much no case does the family definitely state that the shooter wasn't taking certain kinds of medication. Secondly, a lot of mass shootings are really gang violence, and those incidents get lumped in with school shootings, so they flood the data set and make it hard to determine whether SSRIs are influencing a certain kind of shooting.
Yeah, see, so he's hinting at the type of data that people use to deny the involvement, and they're using epidemiological studies where they maybe grab all the mass shooters in an area, and then they say, oh, look, these people, they weren't on these medications, but in gang shootings, there's clearly a motive going on there. Someone walking into a school and mowing people down, that's unusual. I mean, there can be some social contagion there, but it's still it's not the same. And when you pollute the data set by including, different cases in there that aren't similar to the school shootings and stuff like that, it becomes really muddy. And sometimes people use this kind of these data sets and these research to purposefully obfuscate things and to find conclusions that they want.
Now, anecdotally, of course, you'll find plenty of evidence that SSRIs might be linked to school shootings, from Columbine to Northern Illinois University, to the Navy Yard, to the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, to the Black Church in Charleston, to the Old National Bank in Kentucky. The shooters were all confirmed to be on antidepressants. In response to these shootings, you might say that correlation doesn't prove causation. After all, these shooters were taking SSRIs because they were unstable. Doesn't necessarily prove that SSRIs made their condition worse, and that's true, but there is additional affirmative evidence to believe that SSRIs are in fact making these shooters' condition worse. For one thing, there's the FDA black box label on these drugs, which indicates that they can increase the risk of suicidal thinking and behavior.
Do you know what's crazy? I think one of the reasons they want to suppress, the story about the drugs making people suicidal or homicidal is they want it to be as easy as possible for doctors to prescribe these meds. And in an outpatient setting, usually within the first month, like someone will see a doctor like 3 times or something like that for like 20 minutes. And it's such a limited amount of time to be able to actually be like, hey, are you having any behavioral changes? Can I call like your spouse or your mom just to check in and see how you're doing? These settings aren't set up for like appropriate assessments for adverse behavioral changes. And so drug companies, they don't want people looking into this because all of a sudden it's like, hey, if you're going to prescribe these drugs, you better spend a lot more time with the patients, talk to their families, and make sure that nothing strange is happening with them. And so they want to make them seem a lot safer. So family medicine doctors feel okay just like dishing them out with 8 minutes of FaceTime per visit.
And there's this. A few years ago, researchers writing in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine found that the antidepressants doubled the risk of suicidality and violence when they were given to healthy people with no mental health disorders. And this is a direct quote from the journal. Antidepressants double the occurrence of events in adult healthy volunteers that can lead to suicide and violence. Now, how is that possible? How can a drug make someone violent and suicidal? How can a drug put violent suicidal thoughts in a person's head? How does that work? How does it work? Well, the truth is, we have no idea. The people prescribing the drugs have no idea. The people making the drugs have no idea.
So he's right. On a mechanistic level, we don't know what's going on. But man, I've seen some dark things. As a psychiatrist specializing in adverse behavioral side effects, I've seen, people simply from the drug effect start to get really morbid, obsessive, dark thoughts. They think very taboo things that they would never want to share. It's almost like you enter hell and your brain is taken over. That's what happens when you tweak your neurology. And these are the types of states that can make you suicidal. Another interesting case that happened recently, we covered it about 2 weeks ago on the channel, was about Thomas Kingston, who was on an antidepressant for not very long. I think he was on 2 different antidepressants back to back for maybe a couple of weeks. And then even after he came off, I think he killed himself 3 weeks later. And I only know what's in the media, but from what I know about these medications, I think he had a neurotoxic adverse reaction. I think he had a severe reaction to it. It damaged his brain. And then he was put in a place where he had very unstable mood and dark thoughts. And then on a whim, he killed himself. And so these drugs, they can be toxic to the brain sometimes, and they can put you in a really dark, impulsive place. And the sad thing is, and the scary thing is we're not studying this in any way. We can't predict this. We haven't gotten a group of people together and researched them. So we have risk factors for who this is going to happen to. So far, the only risk factor we know is younger age, people with immature serotonin systems that fully haven't developed. So it's people usually under age 25. In this age group, when you look at the FDA clinical trials, you're more likely to have a suicidal thought or behavior if you're on the drug. Now, just think about that for a second. Isn't that nuts? Isn't that crazy that we put people under 25 on these drugs when you are more likely to have a suicidal event on the drug than off the drug? That's how insane things have gotten at the moment.
We have no clue why these drugs supposedly work in the first place, if they actually do work. And we have no idea whether they might turn normal people into violent maniacs. But it's obviously a very concerning finding, especially given how much doctors are overprescribing these drugs to any patient who claims to be depressed. It is very, very, very easy to get an antidepressant drug. This is not a difficult thing to do. And the whole diagnostic process relies entirely on self-report. It is just you telling the doctor how you feel and what's going on with you, okay? It's why it's not like diagnosing a real physical illness where they can run tests and they can look at your body and they can detect that there are lesions, there are tumors, there are things going wrong in the body.
And he's totally right. I think people think that depression, like I've got clinical depression. Oh, that's like the real version. That's the real medical version. I got major depressive disorder. They dress it up in these terms that make it seem a lot more medical and scientific than it is. Where at the end of the day, it's a list of 9 symptoms. And if you have 5 of them, you have depression. And these symptoms can be really varied. Some of them are actually polar opposites, like you can be sleeping too much or sleeping too little. You can be too tired or too energetic. You can be overeating or you can be undereating. And researchers have looked at this. And when they look at, they do a factorial on this because there's 9 things and there's 5 different combinations of things that you could have together. There's over 10,000 different ways you could meet criteria for depression. And so this idea that depression is this one thing it's not true. It's different for every person. Depending on the symptoms, it's going to be a different experience. We just give it all the same name. And if you're interested in learning more about this, again, let's put a little pop-up here in the video for something I shot not so long ago. It's called, As a Doctor, I Misunderstood Depression for Years. And it goes into how depression is diagnosed. And he's right. It's just by patient report. And honestly, doctors do these assessments in a couple of minutes and then just like, okay, sure, you're depressed. And they give someone a med and the person walks away thinking, oh, a biochemical illness, that's medical. It's crazy.
But with these psychiatric illnesses, these alleged psychiatric illnesses, none of that exists. They're not doing brain scans. They're not looking at anything. It's just based on what you're telling them. Which means that anybody who wants to get any psychiatric drug can get it. Doctors would rather prescribe those drugs than tell patients the truth about their depression and how to deal with it. I can say that in my personal life, and this is anecdotal, but it's all anecdotal, okay? Everything is based on anecdotes. The diagnostic criteria is based on anecdotes. Everything is just anecdotes. It's just people telling stories about what's going on with them, people they know. That's what all this is. So I'll say that in my case, I've known many people who take antidepressants, and in almost every case, there are glaringly obvious things in their lives that would cause any normal person to be depressed. In almost every case, I can look at their life and say, well, yeah, I'd be kind of depressed too if I had this going on, right? So depression is actually a totally rational response to their circumstance.
And see, this is one of the things that I hate about the way psychiatry is practiced these days. Yeah, I mean, if you tell someone they have an illness and you put them on a drug, you rob them. There's an opportunity cost there. You rob them of the opportunity to actually fix the root cause. And sometimes it takes a while to dwell on it before you realize, shit, I'm in the wrong relationship, or I need to find a different job, or the trauma that I've had in the past is clouding the way I see the world, and it's given me a whole bunch of maladaptive behaviors that are holding me back and I need to fix it. Or I'm working too hard. I'm not looking after my health. I never exercise. I don't eat food. When you tell someone they have a brain disease, instead of helping them look at their life and question it, you've robbed them of that opportunity. The problem just festers and it doesn't get any better.
But instead of making lifestyle changes or dealing with the underlying trauma, they're given drugs that effectively numb their brain. They don't make them feel better. It just numbs them. So they don't feel the feeling anymore. But the thing that's causing the feeling is not being addressed. And it will never be addressed if you don't have the feeling that calls attention to the underlying problem. So it's just like giving someone a painkiller to make it hurt less when they put their hand on a hot stove. The stove is still burning them. The pain from the stove is not the problem, right? When you put your hand on a hot stove and it hurts, the hurting is not the problem. That's actually good. That means that your nervous system is working like it's supposed to. The pain is good. It's a good thing because it's alerting you to the fact that your hand is on a stove.
It's crazy. This is what doctors should be doing. I mean, we need to be the ones helping our patients interpret the wisdom from their body because these symptoms are telling us that things are wrong. And instead of doing that, I mean, we've just like sold out to insurance companies to see patients in, rapid succession for higher income. And sold out to the drug companies. We're not helping patients interpret symptoms and fixing them. It's a disaster.
So you have to take your hand off the stove. That's the solution. So the reason the medical establishment and Democrats are panicking over RFK's commission is simple. The moment people realize that they have agency, when they realize that they can take their hand off the stove, they become a lot harder to control. They also become a lot harder to monetize. For big pharma and corporate media outlets that sell advertising space to big pharma, the implications are obviously pretty dire. But for Americans hoping to reverse this country's long-standing public health decline after a generation of junk science and fake clinical trials, it's a change that's long overdue.
One of the things I like most about this place we are right now is politically in this country is there's a lot more awareness about the influences of big money. He's right. I mean, the reason you don't see this on CNN, NBC, and these other outlets is they make oodles of money from pharmaceutical adverts, and they go, I'm not about to shoot myself in the foot and lose this ad spend. Again, corporate interests over sharing information that's like actually helpful to people. I covered a Matt Walsh video not so long ago, and people were like, "Oh my God, Dr. Josef, he's just interested in conservatives and things like that." What I would say to that is, show me some liberal news outlets covering things on this. I would cover them. I'm not just partial to one type of media. Although what I will say to this video is, I pretty much agreed with nearly everything that he said today, almost to the point where I'm like, Matt, do you watch my YouTube channel? But I think it's interesting right now that this is only covered in conservative media when this isn't a partisan issue. Drugging people who don't need drugs shouldn't be a partisan issue. This should be something that people on the right, the left, and the center all care about. But right now, at this period of time, it's crickets from the left. And I think that really needs to change. So I hope you enjoyed tuning in for this reaction to this Matt Walsh video. If you need help safely coming off psychiatric medications, we're essentially giving away our entire protocol on how we help people come off medications. Absolutely free. Use it anywhere in the world. Share it as much as you'd like. There's going to be a link to the video that shows you how to get it right here. Thanks.